be here.
Yeah, I know. So I have
sexy.
one other little weird tidbit, a little surprise for you.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
We were both born on July 12th, 1967.
Come now.
How about that for a winner? I just found that out about 2 hours ago.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So I know all about it.
So we're both cancers,
Yes.
and we're out tonight. So
That's right.
good for us.
I can feel where you're coming from.
Yeah.
We also each have 3 kids. So this is a baby-friendly reading. I saw the most adorable baby in the world right there. So if those two want to join us, that's fine with me. Okay. Thanks for coming.
Do you want that? Can you hear all right without the mic, or do you want the mic?
Here.
Okay.
That's me before.
Yeah. But now watch this.
Here's me after.
Ooh.
Thanks for coming. Thanks, Book Passage, for hosting us. It's a fantastic store at a great location, and to everyone who came out, on this Wednesday evening to join us. Yes, there's open chairs for sure. No.
Okay.
I think those are.
I think they're late.
Those are the previous owners of the chairs.
Okay.
But thanks for joining us tonight. The book is fantastic. It's an amazing mix of a father-son novel, an investigation of writing, a New York novel about legacies and death and grieving, and it's an ambitious book. It's really fantastic. You're probably tired of hearing the word ambitious, but I mean, you have to, apply it here. It's a book that shoots for everything, and I really love that. And it's one of the books that's invigorating the novel, I think. I've got some questions for you. I'm sure everyone does. I hope we can have a conversation. Feel free to, butt in with comments and elbow in any questions. There's no set forum here. But I was wondering, could you read just a small passage for us?
Sure.
Do you mind?
No. I'll just read the first paragraph, right?
That sounds great.
That's always the easy thing to read. Okay.
And there he sat, up front, all alone in the first pew. For those who asked, the ushers confirmed it with a reluctant nod. Yep, that's him. For those who cared but said nothing, they gave themselves away by staring sideways and pretending to be impressed by the nearby stained glass, as if devotees of Cornelius the Centurion or Godfrey of Bouillon, instead of a 79-year-old writer with gout. Rumor had it he might show. His oldest and dearest friend, Charles Henry Topping, was dead. Funeral on Tuesday at St. James on 71st and Madison. Be respectful, dress appropriately, see you there. Some of the faithful brought books in hopes of getting them signed. A long shot, but who could resist? And by 11:15, the church was almost full. I remember watching friends of my father as they walked down that aisle, while they glimpsed the Slocums and the Coopers, and over there the Engleharts, hello by way of regretful grin. A number of these fellow mourners baffled them. Were those sneakers? Was that a necklace or a tattoo, a hairdo or a hat? It seemed death had an unfortunate bride side. One seated all and sundry leafed through the program, nicely engraved, good paper, and gauged the running time in their head, which mercifully lacked a communion. But there was a universal thrill for the eulogist, since the man up front was notoriously private, bordering on reclusive. Excitement spread via church-wide mutter. Thumbs composed emails, texts, status updates, tweets. This New York funeral suddenly constituted a chance cultural event, one of those I was there moments so prized in this city, even if you had known the writer from way back, knew him before he was famous and won all those awards, knew him as a strong ocean swimmer and an epic climber of trees, knew his father and his mother, his stepfather, knew his childhood friends, all of whom knew him as Andy or Andrew, rather than the more unknowable A.N. Dyer.
Wonderful.
Oh, that was easy. Yeah, it is. I didn't set out to write an ambitious book. I just set out to kind of do this story of a writer as fully as possible, and so I really wanted to dig into the writer's full career so that you get kind of 14 books for the price of one in some ways. So it's a bargain, this book. And so there's snippets of all these other novels that A.N. Dyer has written, and then there's a big chunk of this first novel he wrote, which is called Ampersand, which is kind of his Catcher in the Rye, because he's kind of a J.D. Salinger meets Philip Roth with a little bit of Updike and a little smattering of Cheever. And so actually the writing, I think what is maybe ambitious are all these other books that are referenced in this book, but that, in fact, that was the easiest part of the writing, was just imagining all these novels and writing little snippets of novel without actually having to write a full novel, because it was just a relief. You could kind of just do a paragraph and say, oh, and that's a novel. Trust me, it is. And so that was like liberating.
Some of you have read the book, some of you probably haven't, but the Catcher in the Rye book that A.N. Dyer's written is called Ampersand. You do get excerpts. You get an actor, reading the main character's voice. I so believed that book. Were you tempted to write it? I mean, I kind of thought this could have been a blind assassin novel in the novel, and maybe in the middle I was going to flip to the first page of Ampersand. I mean, is the whole book in your head? How did you not write it?
Well, if the book's a huge success, get ready for Ampersand in 2016. No, like in your moments when you're right before falling asleep and you're thinking about your book and what you should do, and then you always, you think you send an email to yourself, and your wife's like, who are you talking to right now? There are moments where you're like, I could probably write Ampersand, because I've thought it through pretty well, and I could do that. The real danger of Ampersand within this novel is the fact that it's considered this classic book that everyone, it's beloved. It's like Catcher in the Rye. So there are big chunks of Ampersand in the novel itself, so you could read that and say, this is a classic? I don't think so. Who's he trying to fool here? This is far from a classic. So there's that danger. But I do feel like, I knew the story of Ampersand pretty well.
Oh, but just before we move on, I mean, it had this great voice. It had this edgy, interesting character. It had a great plot mechanism, too. The kidnapping of the headmaster's son, and what you do with him, and who makes the decision, and what are the repercussions. And then this insider look at Exeter that we all want to see, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I was there for it. I would read
Once
it.
again, if it's a big hot seller, get ready for Ampersand 2016. No, and I think I was interested. I did think about it, but it took me 6 years to write this book. So I think by the time, if I could write Ampersand, people would be like, Amper what? It'd be long forgotten. So.
A writer's life is at the center of this book. I'm curious, growing up in New York, what did writers mean to you? Why did you want to write a book about a writer? This, is kind of an exalted portrait, but also a piercing critique of what it means to dedicate your life to making books. And since you do that too, I'm curious about what made this material personal and why you wanted to spend 6 years with this writer.
Well, there were many years where I wasn't sure I wanted to spend as much time with him. It was, my dad's kind of from the generation of the Eisenhower era of kind of these men who are kind of unknowable, and they are really unable to communicate, and they leave all that work to their wives. And my dad is impressive, interesting guy, and I kind of wanted to try to look at that character by way of what if your father was a famous novelist and you had all these books that hinted at this intense interior life and this sensitivity and empathy, and yet the man that you saw at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner had none of those characteristics, was just totally unknowable. And how would that make you feel? Would you either say, well, I have these books and that's enough, to know my father and to have that as my kind of legacy of my time with him? Or would you just be bitter and angry that why isn't my dad giving me as much time for me as he does for his writing. For me, I don't know about you with your children, I find writing is so much, it's such a 24-hour-a-day job, and you're always kind of thinking through little things that you might be working on at that moment, that you can really not be living in the moment because you're always contemplating, you know, the next paragraph or the next chapter. And what I found with having children, and I love having children, it's like my favorite thing in the world, is that you do get out of your own head, that you do live in the present if you're really trying to do a good job of it. And that was, you know, like oxygen for me, because it allowed me just to not think about writing, get on your hands and knees and just, you know, spend, you know, 3 hours playing with your kid. And the way that writing used to be for me when I first started, I don't know about you, but I could write and get lost in time, you know, and look up at the clock and it'd be, oh my God, 4 hours have passed? That does not happen to me with writing anymore. The clock, I'm constantly looking at the clock and I'm like, oh shit, only 3 minutes have passed? God, can I take a nap now? But with kids, I can play with my son or daughters and have that experience of, oh, 3 hours have just passed? This is amazing. I mean, do you feel that way with your kid? I mean, are you pretty, with your writing and you're in the middle of a project, do you find that your children suffer for it, or your family life suffers for it?
I think I ignore my children for long stretches, and then try to make it up to them, and
Right.
and then I feel like teaching is a full-time job, and writing is a full-time job, and being a parent is a full-time job. And working overtime, I can do 2 of them well. I always feel like I'm a bad teacher, a bad writer, or a bad parent, and I just try to take turns. And I was a pretty distant father for a few months working on a project this year. This summer I've just been every day full-time dad to try to get back at it. In this book, we see letters and portraits and writings from the younger writer, the younger novels, and he's vivacious and curious and engaged. And then we meet the older writer, who's reclusive and spent in many ways. Sometimes in fiction, I'll make what Jung said, someone can, know about you in 3 seconds what it'll take you 10 years to discover about yourself. Sometimes I've realized my book's like, the most no-brainer things about my own life. You mentioned your father was this Eisenhower era figure. In writing the book, did that shed insight into maybe the man he was before you knew him, or the man? The question is how? How does someone go from being so alive to so circumscribed? Does your work reflect back into your own life?
I think in exploring like fatherhood and all of its repercussions, I certainly had, it was an education, and it was a discovery. And the biggest discovery for this book was having my father read it.
Wow.
And really loved it. And he's in kind of failing health. And so it was incredibly moving for me. And because I was petrified of him reading the book, because I feel like he's on every page in some way or form, though my father is not like A.N. Dyer at all, but it's still how he's going to make that leap of imagination, thinking that this is all about him. But he loved the book, and so that was the most eye-opening experience of writing the book, and it's actually made us much closer. In the galley, there's like a little interview in the back, and I was really nervous about that because he read the galley, and that was his favorite part because it was like I was able to talk to him in a way without actually having to risk the words in person, because they always fail you, or they often do. And so like in the letters that you see that A.N. Dyer has written to his best friend, the book opens up in a funeral of A.N. Dyer's oldest friend, named Charles Topping. And the letters are interspersed throughout between A.N. Dyer to Charles Topping. You get a sense of what that relationship is. I so often find that the best version of myself is in my writing. And the thing that's so difficult about people reading your book and saying, "Oh, I love your book. It's great," or "I don't," whatever they're going to say, is that you know that's not really you, because this is you spending 6 years crafting every sentence and trying to make it the best version of yourself, where you are invariably a disappointment. So I also, I mean, just are, you are. I mean, I'm pretty great, don't get me wrong. No, and so I also wanted to explore, if you had a really huge career, like a J.D. Salinger, you can totally understand that desire to get away. Because you know that every time someone says, you know, your book changed my life, it makes you want to shrivel up a little bit more. Because you know that it's just a book, I'm nothing, I'm not that book. And so I think I can totally understand where all that praise made Salinger need to just run away. Because every time someone said, "I love your book," he hated himself a little bit more, I think. So, I mean, I think that's the difficulty in some ways of writing, is that when you put yourself out there, not only are you putting yourself out there to be, you know, critiqued, but you're also putting out this version of yourself that is, in some ways, a fraud of who you are. Yet, you have spent all this time trying to, you know, create this version. It's I don't know, it's confusing.
It's also a New York novel, and there's a long tradition of writing about New York that, you know, we're a 46-year-old writer to take that on.
We are 46-year-old writers.
It might feel a little daunting to go up against some of the masterful, iconic portraits of New York. I mean, did you feel that in writing a New York? I felt like a New York book to me. I was like, it matters that we're on this corner, that we're looking at that fountain, and seeing this arch, and that we're in this lobby, and looking at this pretzel cart. You know?
Right.
I felt like you were documenting a New York in a particular place in time forever, because it mattered a great deal to you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, mostly it was, I didn't really think about previous New York novels per se. I mean, I thought about some of the echoes in Catcher in the Rye. So, you know, some of the Central Park scenes have echoes of Holden Caulfield's travels through the city. But, you know, for the longest time, I didn't want to write about New York. It was the last place I wanted to visit in my writing. And finally, as a 46, or actually when I started, whatever, 40-year-old man, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to now write about New York, to try to tell that story and to try to put my experience down on the page and to celebrate it in its way and to really catalog what that version of New York meant to me and to my youth. And so, I mean, there's a little sequence in a hamburger joint that's, you know, still there. It's like one of the last, you know, places that are still evidence of my childhood. But that was a place where every Friday after school, my mother and I would get a hamburger together. And so it's just like I want to put that down on paper. I want to kind of honor that now. I want to honor, you know, the Alice in Wonderland statue, and I want to do the times where I would go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you get terribly lost, and the experience of just walking around and falling through these wormholes of art. And so it was really just a way to try to get my life on paper the way I experienced it, and also kind of in a weird way as a document for my own kids to kind of have, you know. It's like this little wedge of book is kind of a wedge of time in my life, and that they can, at some point, when they're ready for some of the language issues in the book, to pull it down and you know, experience it and kind of have a little inkling of me. So it is kind of like that A.N. Dyer, ironically, that A.N. Dyer way of, you know, this is, yes, you know me as a dad, but this is me as a writer.
Is that a boat? Okay. I'm not very nautical. In my first novel, it's a kind of nutty novel, but anyway, I wrote it, and the publisher hired a guy to dress up like my character and to look like my character, and they photographed him and put him on the cover of my book. And at first I thought, well, that's not the dude in my head, but he wasn't a bad-looking guy, and he had this cool beard, and Over the course of a year, I came to see him as my character. I thought, oh, that's Hank, you know? And I just looked at that book all the time. I thought, that's my character. And then I went to LA and I gave a reading. And when I got up, there was a nice group of very smart people, just like this audience here. And there he was, sitting there. And I was like, that's my character. And when I was reading, he like seemed to be looking at me. And he seemed to know what I was saying. And I had the strangest break with reality meeting. And it was just the guy they'd hired to take the picture. And afterwards he tried to stick his novel in my hands to, get me to read it. But
your character would so do that.
In your book, there's this fabulous extended sequence of the Frick. It's a huge literary party that looks at all levels of literary society. People who are at the top and bottom and worming and squirming, and people who just want some free canapes. But you drag your novelist to this literary party where he meets his character. Can you tell us about that? I thought it was just dynamite. Can you tell us what inspired that and when that came to you?
So in the book, there are three sons. There's Richard and Jamie, who are the older boys. Then there's Andy, who is the product of an affair that ruined what was a good marriage that Ann Dyer had, and forever estranged these sons who were already pretty estranged from their dad. And one of the sons, Richard, is a budding screenwriter, and he has his screenplay idea. But really, everyone in Hollywood wants the rights to Ampersand because it's like Catcher in the Rye. It's never been made into a movie. And so there's this young, hot actor, kind of think of, I don't know, maybe Brad Pitt back in the day. And he's desperate to play this Edgar Mead character who's kind of like the Holden Caulfield character in Ampersand. And so I initially had that sequence set up in which Richard is thinking that he's in a scenario where he's going to sell a screenplay and all of his dreams are going to come true. And at the end it gets undercut by the reality of the fact that they just want his father's, Ampersand. They just want his work. And I had the Eric Hart character, this actor, Brad Pitt-like guy, in that sequence. And I was like, okay, he was a pretty good character. But I didn't really have a sense that he was going to necessarily come back at the Frick. I thought, okay, that's interesting. Maybe he'll visit New York, or maybe there's going to be some sort of, he's going to try to worm into Ann Dyer's life. But then I decided, since this is a book about echoes and kind of a Hall of Mirrors like scenario, it would be interesting if I could get Eric Hart to dress up as the character of Edgar Mead and come to the Frick, and what would that do to Ann Dyer, who was already in the midst throughout this book of what is most definitely some sort of a psychotic break. So once I had that scenario set up, I had to figure out, okay, how do I get him to the party, and I had to figure out the kind of the architecture around that. But once I got him to the party, it was just fun. It was like, okay, I can have him doing this little thing, and then get Ann Dyer to butt into him and think, my God, my character is here now. And there's a tremendous amount of guilt that Ann Dyer feels about Ampersand. So to have that, almost like a Macbeth-like sequence where he's seeing this character who represents, this moment in time in which he wrote this book and kind of betrayed his best friend. Once you kind of, it's one of those moments in writing that rarely happens, where it's like two balls that are up in the air kind of land together, and you're like, oh, okay, this works. I always feel like a novel is you have this idea, then you have that idea, and this idea, and they don't really all connect, and then suddenly a fourth idea comes, and you're like, oh, wait a second, they can now all connect, and I have a novel now. Instead of maybe 3 short stories or whatever those 3 indistinct objects are.
And you're a failure. It's an angelic moment. The actor is in character to try to get this role. So he's dressed like the character, he's got the affect perfect, and he's reciting monologues as he's swilling cocktails. And here comes the man who's written the words that's coming out of his mouth.
Yeah, and he sees Eric interacting with his youngest, with Andy, who's 17. And Ann Dyer is very protective of Andy because he wants Andy to, whatever Andy does, he doesn't want Andy to be anything like him. He wants him to be to repair all the injuries that A.N. Dyer has done in his fiction. He wants Andy to be kind of to break that kind of behavior. So when he sees Eric Hark as Edgar Mead talking to Andy, that just gets him infuriated because he thinks that this creation is trying to sabotage this chance of redemption that is his son Andy.
Yeah. The true personification of what has cost his family so much. I've got a lot of questions, but do people have questions they want to throw out here? Susan?
Yes. I have any number of questions, and I'm going to be very circumspect in how I ask this.
Yes.
Near the middle of this novel, you learn a lot more about the affair that brought Andy into this family, and it's a pretty astonishing tale, and it felt like in the midst of, okay, I know what story I'm reading, here's this fairly realistic family drama and a little satire, and suddenly there's this new plot element that was really unexpected. Can you talk at all, without revealing anything to all the people that haven't read it, about the choice you made there?
Did people hear the question? Do we need to repeat it?
She's talking about the large duck that comes waddling in. I was really interested in having that situation in which, what if you could meet your father when he was 17? How would your impressions of this Eisenhower era unknowable man change if you could see him at his most vulnerable?
Okay.
So that was kind of one of the main, notes I had when I started writing the book, and one of the main kind of inspirations behind the book. So I wanted to set up a scenario in which that is presented in as real a way as possible, yet also couched in uncertainty. Whether this is actually real, or if this is just another level of fiction making. Mm-hmm. Because the book itself is kind of an exploration of the way we create fiction, whether literally with writing, or with family, or with the lies we tell ourselves, or the lies we try to convince others about us. So I wanted it to kind of float there with uncertainty, so that the reader had to be active in their possible interpretation of it. I certainly have my truth of what I think it is. So I'm sorry to be so weak.
No, you're actually answering it really well.
But I also didn't want to make a definite, I didn't want to weigh it in a definite direction. I wanted it just to be there. Because the book is also told. You have 4 characters that you follow, and you follow these 4 characters through the eyes of one character, who is the son of A.N. Dyer's best friend, whose funeral you're at the beginning. And he's an incredibly unreliable narrator, and he's telling you things that there's no way he can possibly, he wasn't, in situations that he's reporting about. So you don't know where the truth is in what he's saying as well. So there are those questions of fiction making, of authorship, mm-hmm. of who is really telling us this story and how stories are told to us. And I also then wanted to put as many different kinds of stories in here as possible. That's why I wanted the letters, and that's why I kind of wanted a little screen, like the different ways we write, the different ways we express mm-hmm. ourselves, and also kind of different genres of writing. So I try to kind of mash it all together and hope that it makes sense at the end of the day, or that it makes enough sense to make you question what the actual, intent was. If that makes sense.
Just on the issue of topping, I thought one of the boldest moves in the book was to narrate it through a first-person narrator who actually enters other people's perspectives. And at first it's kind of fun. He's like, oh, he's at the funeral. Okay, he kind of saw that. They were over there, but he got it. And he floats into their minds. And, we live in such a tradition of close realism that these rules seem inviolate to some degree. And so I kept making excuses for how maybe he could infer that, and that, oh, he happened to be at the restaurant over here. That finally he's like, actually, I didn't go to the party, but when they went there, I knew they must have said this. And we go into the total close third-person, realism, and filtering what seems like, in many ways, a shifting third person through 4 focalizations through this first person narrator who has a vested interest in the story, I thought was quite daring and inspiring. You know, did you start in the third person? I hate to be writerly, but I just want to know. Did you start in the third person? Did you start in the first? How did you find your way through these characters and through your structure?
Can I lose the mic? Can everyone hear me just fine without it? Because I feel like
I'm like in Vegas.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. It was basically, I had the first little, it's written in 8 chapters, and each chapter has 3 sections. And the first section was, of that first chapter, was just going to be straight third person. And then you were going to get introduced to Philip Topping, who was our narrator in the beginning of the second section of the first chapter. But then after doing that, I realized it's just too early on, it's too much of a shift that I had to have him more present in the beginning. And I like unreliable narrators. I'm intrigued by them. I think it opens up a whole, can of worms. And I also like the story of the guy who's got his face pressed up against the glass, and he's envying this other family for all the wrong reasons. And so that, as a narrator, as a viewpoint, was kind of fascinating to me. I still don't. He would pop up, of all the characters who would pop up in inappropriate places, he was the one while I was writing. I was like, oh, I've got to touch on Philip right here, or he would just insist on kind of, making his appearance. And sometimes that was annoying to me, which I think sometimes in the book probably is annoying that he's making an appearance. But also I thought it was really, it was what I was setting out to try to do, was to try to do what Philip Roth does with the Zuckerman books. Like, Zuckerman kind of goes into everything, and we don't really question that. And so I wanted to challenge myself that way and see if we could read a book without, insisting on absolute veracity, and then that makes us question what is fiction and what is not, and who is controlling the story, who is the puppet master here.
A little louder, please.
Oh yeah, here, I'll go back to the
You
mic.
don't have to use the mic, you just check a little bit.
Okay.
We'll both use them.
No, let's just talk a little bit.
Oh, we'll talk a little bit
Yeah.
louder. Yeah. Well, I think it's a fascinating maneuver, and it does. And our narrator has a vested interest in how he's perceived in relation to this story and what story's been appropriated from him, and it does invite all of these questions. Did you have a question right here?
A short question. What year was your dad born in?
He was born in 1933 because he's turning 80 this year. Yes.
I'm just interested. I'm thinking about what you mean by an Eisenhower era.
Well, just
person.
that kind of unable to communicate in a really in an honest way, like feeling that is exposing too much of himself, that he wants to keep that shut off. And I think because they were raised by
the culture.
Yeah, and they were raised by men who were even more shut off. So they were no doubt doing their best under most circumstances, but really unable and unwilling often, because they didn't seem like that was their task, and that they had these wives who would take on these duties. So I just wanted to, and for me, I've told the story before, but my father, was an incredibly impressive guy, and I remember once I was at this lunch, and he stood up and he said a few words, and he said it beautifully and graciously and on his, extemporaneously, and it was just really impressive. But he's done that before. And I was sitting next to an old friend of his, and the old friend turned to me and said, "It always amazes me to see your dad do this, because when he was 17, he could barely look you in the eye. He was so shy, and he would stutter, and he was so painfully shy he would just be in the corner." And this was just not the father that I knew. The father I knew was, intimidating and at worst aloof, just kind of distant. I could only really participate in my father's life when I learned how to participate in the things that he enjoyed doing. So that was really the only time that we would spend together, was doing the things he liked to do. So yeah, and that's what I mean by these dads who are just weren't quite prepared to jump into fatherhood.
How much of that is, I understand what you're talking about in terms of the time, but how much of that is cultural or religious?
It's certainly, it's waspy, for sure.
Okay.
And I come from a long line of very waspy people.
Right.
For a tiny bit of good and for a lot of bad.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely in that culture of waspdom in which it's just, the facade. And let's not ever break that facade. The facade is all important. What happens behind the facade, as long as no one sees it, is, fine. So.
6 years. How did you keep the breath of working? And then did you string it all out, write it all out, and then go back and re-edit, or did you chapter by chapter by chapter?
I had a pretty.
Because it did 6 years. It must have generated some gravity consciously in your head. I mean, could you think of other things to write while you were writing this?
Yeah, and I do some screenplay work, so I would break it up with doing screenplays, because that's like just eating dessert, because it's for one thing, a screenplay is really only about 25 pages of real work, and the rest is just beautiful white space that the format just insists on. And so screenplays, I did about 3 screenplays while writing this book. So
you got paid for them?
What's that?
And you got paid for them?
You got it to some degree. Still waiting. And so, it's Hollywood. And so I would break it up a little bit just to have a little break from that world. But I had it pretty well structured to a degree. I had every chapter laid out, and I knew where each character was going, and I knew the intersecting arcs. And my advice to writers, starting out, or when you start a novel, is, just write fast and get it all out. And then go back and do the real business of writing. That's the best way to write a novel, I think. That said, that's not how I write a novel. I can't take a step forward until I'm certain that the step behind me, and maybe even a few miles back, are just right. So it does become this kind of laborious, at times tedious work of just trying to make sure every sentence is right before moving on. And if I could push a button and change the way I write, it would be, I wish I could just get the story out and then go back and do the real work of writing. Because rewriting is really the fun part. And rewriting is really fun when you have the whole thing finished, because then you can see all the connections that you're trying to make and maybe have failed to make, and you can bring those to the surface. And if you're doing it the way I unfortunately do it, often those connections you can't see because you're so up close to it.
Have you ever abandoned a story, a narrative, a novel, something that you invested a lot in? You couldn't get it to work, or it wasn't quite right, and you had to let it go.
I'm getting like an anxiety attack.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, God. No, not yet. I mean, I've had plenty of short stories where I'm like, this is great, this is great, this is, oh my God, no, okay, that's done. But nothing in which it was a year of time. The first novel I wrote, I had those moments in which I wanted to abandon it, and if I had stopped, I think I'd be doing a different line of work if I had. So I'm glad that I kept on, that I insisted on finishing it. But no, I'm pretty stubborn. So I haven't had. It takes so long just to get started that once I'm started, the idea of stopping just feels like an epic failure. Have you? Has that happened to you?
Yeah, it did. I did work on a novel for almost a year, and just realized I was on a fool's errand. That I was doing it for all the wrong reasons. And
when was that in your writing?
It was right before I wrote this last book about North Korea, and it made me very nervous for the whole book. I realized it really is possible to invest a lot of time and fail, and I guess it kind of changed the stakes for me a little bit.
Did it help in writing Orphan Masters? I mean, when you had that, did any of it relate? Were you able to pull little
Oh,
pieces?
no. That would be great if I could cannibalize it or something. But yeah, I think it does. It puts a fear in your head that you will never have, I hope.
Right, yeah, well,
But,
now I will. Thanks.
sorry.
Yeah. Go Cancer, July 12th. Okay.
Yes.
I have a question that, you're talking about when people tell you they
Stop in
loved
this
your
bookstore.
it makes you uncomfortable and sometimes, people feel that they hate themselves a little bit more. I was just wondering how you as a sort of a creative person make that distinction between, how do you protect the artistic side of yourself from the exposure that your art brings?
The artistic side of myself, no one wants to see because it's behind a closed door, and it's it's this, and it's that I don't mind people not seeing that. It's just I do get I think one of the scariest things a writer can hear, and also one of the greatest things, is I'm reading your book, because you're just like, oh, okay, great. Because it's never, they'll say, I love it, and you're like, yeah, right, okay, sure. And then the other scary thing that they can say, even scarier, is, I've read your book, So it's exactly what you want. You want everyone to read your book. You don't work this hard not to want that on a very, very real, in a real way. But once you have people and they're reading your book, I find it absolutely petrifying. What do you get nervous? Do you feel that at all, or do you just like, oh, that's great?
I saw a woman on an airplane reading my book, and that was a real dilemma for me. I really wanted to say, hey. Seriously, I really wanted to say, hey, I know the guy who wrote that. What would she have said? What would she have said? I was too afraid to. And what would I say? The scenarios began running in my head, and none of them were good. I know exactly what you're speaking about.
Yeah, I was on my flight from Seattle to here. I was sitting next to a guy who was reading the New Yorker, which has this review of my book by James Wood, which is amazing that he reviewed the book, but it's also a very mixed review, and there's this illustration of me that makes me look like I'm from, Danny Torrio from 1970.
Oh, there it is right there. Should we open it up?
No, please don't. and so, of course, your ego is going, okay, so he's going through his talk of the town.
Of course he's going to look.
And I'm right next to him, and I'm like, okay, this is going to get interesting. and I'm like, what am I going to say? And he's probably going to see the pictures, and then you're like, and then we'll probably talk about it, and I'll say, well, yeah, it's a mixed review, but it's also very nice, and James Wood, that's great. And so I'm going through this whole thing, and I'm thinking, and I keep on glancing over, and I realize that he's just like, that's a writer's life. Right there.
Oh, yeah, yes, sir, in the back.
Question. Back to the topic of Philip and the narrator. You guys already talked about some of the things which answer some of my questions, but I'm still digesting the book and trying to come to terms with some of my thoughts about Philip, and I'm really curious from your perspective whether you wanted to see him as inconsequential or very consequential to the book because of the way you let us know that he's unreliable, but especially for one event towards the very end of the book, which is critical to the book. Based on your interpretation of that, whether what's reliable or not coming out from him, I'm more curious about kind of your perspective. I'm still kind of coming.
Yeah, I think that he's essentially, to this story, inconsequential, but he's desperate to be consequential.
Right.
And so, by any means necessary to a degree, he wants to spin himself into this tale. And so he is desperate to be up front in the dire tale, though he is really, in the background.
That desperation, is that part of what we see in kind of his voice that's really heavily wrought with simile and terms of the way that always descriptive of everything in that way? Is that part of that desperation?
Well, I also want you to then, so he's a 5th grade teacher and a failed writer.
desperately wants to be a dyer.
Yeah, desperately wants to be a dyer and desperately wants to be a writer. But he's a failed writer. And so the impression is that he's probably not a very good writer, maybe. And so then when you get to the implication of this book, if he's written this book, or if he's the main voice of this book, how can he create this book if he is not a writer?
Right.
So then it makes you question who is the author of the book, who is really telling this tale, who has a history of taking the Topping family and using the Toppings in his fiction. So I wanted it to all kind of, I wanted Philip to be both a real character, but also possibly an imagined character to a degree. So he is both consequential and inconsequential. But that's like the, I think the fun part about writing is trying to come up with these little subtextual things, and often, they often happen after the fact. Someone's like, that part didn't make sense to me. You're like, but wait a second. Okay, I have it all figured out. I know exactly. Okay, so you go back to here. You're trying to, you're prepared for any kind of interpretation by way of the way you can dissect the deep subtext that is not even close to the surface. But you're suddenly like Nixon and Parent. It's there.
I feel just the opposite.
Uh-huh.
People are like, oh, did you see someone spoke to a dog on this page and this page and this page? I'll be like, oh, I never thought of that. I feel very blind.
You don't just go, yes, of course. You don't win a Pulitzer for nothing.
In the book, these issues of appropriation are there. Dyer has stolen directly from his child's journals. He's stolen from the secret inner life of his best friend. We're writers, we take everything from our surroundings. Is this an issue with you and your family? You said your father read the book, and even though he's not the father in there, do you have to confront portraits that end up becoming recognized in some way, or that you recognize?
Mm-hmm. I don't really. I think about that a little bit. I think the interesting response by my mother and father when they read the book. They're not very literary people. They're readers, but they don't read deeply. And so I think what they really enjoyed about this book was that it took place in their backyard, and they could see what a writer does. And they could see, oh, I know that restaurant. Oh, I know the Metropolitan Museum, and they could experience what I do on a very real basis, and that was very intimate, I think, for them to understand their son a little bit better. Now I use the high school Exeter here because it's kind of the boarding school, and it's already been used in fiction once with a separate piece, so I thought, screw it, I can use it again. And I didn't go to Exeter. I did go to a boarding school, but I didn't go to Exeter because I'm not nearly bright enough to go to Exeter. But my wife went to Exeter. And so she was very upset that I used Exeter. She's like, you can't use Exeter. I'm like, why can't I use Exeter? Well, because I went there. Her father went. I'm like, I went there. You can't. That's me. That belongs to me. I was like, I gotta use. I'm sorry, honey. So that was maybe a chilly 24 hours until finally she relented. But I think there are moments where she, particularly the person you're living with, can recognize little glimpses of intimacies, and it can be a little upsetting, and it's definitely something I'm aware of, but I'm not aware of it while I'm writing it. I'm aware of it after it's done. I'm particularly aware of it if it gets so lucky to be published, and then I'm like, oh God, now I'm really in trouble, But it doesn't stop me from exploring it.
What else can you do?
Yeah, exactly. I only have so much experience, so I can't go to just North Korea and do that.
My wife tells me all the time, you can't take that. Oh, don't. That's subversive recognizing.
Right.
Just say, I gotta do it. It's the only time in my life where I really say, I don't have any choice in it.
Mm-hmm.
I have to. I'm gonna steal whatever I'm gonna steal.
Yeah. Like my brother is very upset that he's not in this book. He's like, why'd you leave me out? Why am I not in this book?
Right.
I would talk a lot about the structure of it. Could you talk a little bit more about your relationship to your unconscious, how that walks in, you know, are there surprises? Do you sit there most of the time?
You can lay down right here if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, wait 1 second. I would say the big surprises are when you are, or the mysterious moments when you're like, oh, this is spooky. You're looking for something. You know, you're stuck on something. You're trying to figure out, you know, okay, I'm doing something on, you know, I have a scene with a pretzel cart thing. It's like, what the hell? You know, that's crazy. What am I doing? And then you get panicked, so you go on the internet just to spend some, you know, 3 days just, you know, cruising the internet. But you're panicked about the pretzel thing, and you go on the internet, and the first thing you punch is New York pretzels. Let's talk about New York pretzels. The 10 best pretzel carts in New York. And you're like, okay, that's just plain weird. And that's someone, I don't know what it is. It's obviously just coincidence, but it's coincidence that I have to just, you know, honor in some way. So those are the moments when your antennae are open for what's around you, and often those things will kind of just drop in your lap, and you're like, this is, okay, someone's telling me, whether it's just my unconscious, that you're going in the right direction. And those are just the best parts. Do you have those moments when you're kind of...
Well, the moment you described earlier, in which, oh, I've got an actor playing this, you know, character, and I've got the novelist, and duh, I made them for a reason. Mm-hmm. I've put them, some part of me has known to get them both on the page together, and that they must collide, and I can only attribute it to the unconscious because I don't feel like I know.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, surprise and inevitability, I think, are the twin joys of reading, and when they occur in writing in combination, that's the most satisfying part, I feel.
I've heard musicians and writers often say they don't know where their work comes from. They just sit down and write it, and it comes, and there it is. So that's got to be a subconscious work.
And improvisation,
Yeah.
improvisation is the way of our
Yeah.
time, I think, you know, in music and a lot of art forms. So you just begin, and all the themes and elements of your life come together and form something harmonic. And if you know what it is beforehand, it's ruined. The impulse is gone.
And like, I mean, and this book has a lot of little set pieces and little riffy moments, and those are always the most fun to write. When, like, the story of Andy, this 17-year-old, his character arc is he's just trying to lose his virginity. You know, so every time you dip into Andy's head, it's that riff, which is just a pleasure to write, because basically I'm satisfying myself as a 17-year-old, because I'm, you know, so you fall into the flow of that, and that's where you can experience at times those moments of writing in which, you know, you have found yourself writing for 2 hours and you've lost all sense of the clock.
Can I ask, I mean, in terms of the unconscious, you know, grief is a big element in the book. Our narrator is, to whatever degree, actively engaged in it. We lose a central character in the book. It seems like we're grieving for the novelist, and he's grieving for himself before he passes, which I think is a very real life thing that people go through. You know, I don't want to get personal, but did you know that was going to be in the book? Were you mining something that's a concern to yourself?
I always knew that there was going to be lots of that Anne Dyer was going to be obsessed with death, and that death was going to be kind of the central theme in the book. You know, I have my father, who I've grown very close to, really since he retired from work, and I found myself often, the only way I can really make sense of my dad and make sense of my experience with my dad and to communicate with my dad is I kind of walking the streets of New York, I'll find myself eulogizing him in my head, because that seems, you know, I wish I could say it to him right, you know, there in the moment, but it's such a difficult conversation without it being either morbid or or too sentimental, or just to make it will make him incredibly uncomfortable. So I find myself often trying to make sense of my relationship with my dad by doing these imagined eulogies. So when writing the book, in some ways, that obviously was kind of coming to the surface, was trying to make sense of a difficult relationship, wishing that you could make sense in person, and often only able to really communicate after the fact, which is the heartbreaking aspect of it.
I'm glad he read your book.
Yes, I'm so glad.
Yeah.
And he so this book has, it is a lot about death and making sense of fathers dying, and how the sons are trying to make sense of their fathers. And my dad, right after, in March, was in the hospital for 2 months. And it was a very surreal experience because I had written in my book, kind of the bedside death scene. And here I was, and he really was in very failing health at the time, and I was experiencing it and trying not to experience it via my book, like, oh, this is different from how I wrote it. And it's also, this is how it's the same, to try to to throw that away, just to have the experience of trying to communicate and express one's love at that, impossible moment. But it was very surreal, because the book, there were still moments where I was like, oh, I got that part right. And I was like, shut up, get away. This is real life. This is not fiction right now. And you need to honor this real moment and try to put all the other stuff, put that in the top drawer for another day, not for the moment in which you're experiencing. And those are the dangerous moments of being a fiction writer, in which you're so often observing yourself, thinking about things, that in those present moments you can step back and never really have a present experience with something, because you're always at a slight remove and aware of how this is happening and how it's happening, and taking little mental notes of the ways it is working out, and it's not pleasant.
But you train your mind to do that every day. Hours and hours every day, you train your mind to model the world in that capacity. We have time for a couple more questions. I know we're going to want to sign books and ask personal questions, but there's probably a couple people who didn't get to ask one. Tom?
Yeah. I also want to say that I think you're a terrific story writer as well. I think we should do that from the feed in the collection. I really love the first story. I love the whole story, but I teach that story sometimes because I know it's a happy ending, and no stories do. But I was wondering about the origins of it. Especially I've moved to the suburbs, and my sense of it, of that narrator who is so cynical about everything around him, and then finds this sort of sense of wonder, that's very surprising to him. And that's such a different way of writing a story, I guess, is that usually it moves from wonder to disappointment, in some sort of way. And so, I don't know if it's all subject of the novel, but I just was wondering where that story came.
It came from, is it Tim Robbins? Who's the guy who does the motivational speaker? Tony Robbins. Tim Robbins. He's an actor, right? Tony Robbins used to do that. He used to do the coal and have the people walk on the coal, and it just seemed so crazy. And I remember seeing some sort of documentary in which they would say cool moss as they're going across the coals to convince themselves that they're not actually going to burn. And I was just like, okay, I can use that in a suburban setting. That would be interesting to have kind of either an early or failed version of Tony Robbins, who's been brought together for this, summer, party.
That story, Cool Moss?
Yeah.
You wrote that?
Yeah.
I've taught that story.
Really?
Cool Moss. I read that in the best stories of the South.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. Cool. Sorry. Sorry, I interrupted. I'm sorry.
So you never walked.
And Teen Sniper. I didn't realize you read Teen Sniper.
We're born on the same day.
I know. Because I remember reading that story. I was like, this is a crazy story.
Okay. Okay, let's have one more. Is there one more left?
I have a question.
Yes.
So back to you talked about this earlier, my favorite scene is definitely the Frick party. So you do allude to a lot of authors who are maybe kind of easy to recognize. Have any of them, do you know them and have they contacted you?
No,
What do you think will happen? You think they'll
Nothing.
be happy?
Nothing. No one has,
Do you try?
I don't get a knock on the door and, oh, hi, Mr. Roth, how are you? No one's, or no one in that party sequence is, I think it's all relatively broad. But we'll see. It'll be interesting.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Appreciate your work.